Welcome to Regen Circle. I'm your host, Paige Fay, and today I'm beyond excited to tackle a topic many feel trepidation towards, but that is crucial to creating a systemic shift in our food system. Today we have the privilege of sitting down with Arya McLaughlin and Harley Cross, the founders of Landcore. Landcore is a 501c3 nonprofit organization advancing soil health programs and policies that create value for farmers, businesses, and communities. The organization was formed in response to the clear and urgent need to address the lack of infrastructure and direct economic incentives that would make the rapid adoption and scalability of regenerative soil health possible. Since their founding, the organization has risen to the center of the national soil health conversation, including guiding the successful passage of language in both the House and the Senate in 2019, supporting soil health at the USDA, and building a broad coalition of farmers, businesses, and NGOs to help secure over $50 million in federal investment in soil health in the 2018 Farm Bill. Let's dive in. The first thing that I'd love to talk to you all about is the founding of Landcore, your organization. What motivated you guys to establish Landcore, especially during the politically divisive time, and how did the political climate shape your early goals and strategies?
Well, it's great to be with you, Paige. Thanks for having us. Uh, well, I think we were motivated by our own personal backgrounds. We both have backgrounds in business and in communications. And I think at its simplest sense, we had a little bit of a cart before the horse issue where we could see that as much as we communicated with individuals or the public about the incredible sort of power of soil, or as much as we sort of tried to appeal to businesses to say you should be supporting farmers who are building their soil in your supply chains, we realized that there was just really some missing economic incentives and infrastructure that would allow producers to scale and to adopt and to sort of participate in this kind of like either wider movement. And so we realized that we wanted to create more economic incentives for producers. We felt that there was infrastructure that could be increased that would allow the adoption of soil health practices to scale in the US. And then for us, it was kind of looking around at the existing infrastructure. We realized that so much of what we grow and how we grow it in this country is really determined by federal policy. And so everything from the US Department of Agriculture, even at the time, the organic certification, but also agencies like the Natural Resource Conservation Service that have offices in almost every county around the country. These are examples of public infrastructure, and we just felt like we really wanted to not reinvent the wheel, but start with that infrastructure and yeah, make a change through that sort of lever of public policy.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with what Ari was saying. I think that the resources that the federal government have in terms of the way and extent to which they engage with the American agricultural producer is really vast. And if you want to, um, if you identify changes that need to be made, that is one of the most powerful resources that you have. And so we really embarked on building out those relationships so that we could engage more directly with more producers at scale.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's a lot of people that are intimidated to dive into this landscape. And you guys have such diverse backgrounds. I wouldn't see it as the traditional track for working in policy. I mean, you guys have backgrounds in, communications, entrepreneurship, and even creative industries. How have these experiences influenced your approach in advancing soil health and policy?
Well, I can say for myself, I have this background in business. I've been working in all these different areas for many, many years. And I think that there is a practicality that comes from a sort of a traditional business background that is sometimes different than the emotional motivation that a lot of other people have for different causes and different things. So uh, when I looked at soil health as being this really important thing that needed to be expanded at scale. And when the initial conversations that Ari and I had, I think that we just looked at it from a very practical perspective, much less emotional, heartfelt like, oh, these are these grand things that we want to do, but or looking at the individual um, challenges of a farm or of a one business, but kind of looking at the system and what is needed to shift the system at scale. And government was one of the big uh, pieces of the puzzle.
Talking a little bit about the role of policy and collaboration, Landcorps was founded during the first Trump administration. How did you all identify opportunities to make progress in a somewhat polarized political environment? And as we record this, he's actually being inaugurated into his second term. And so, what lessons could be applied into this return to office?
Yeah, well, I think as a starting point, Harley and I were on the same page from the get-go about the framing or positioning of soil health as a sort of a kind of not only keystone issue, but an issue of common ground. So we felt both at the time, certainly now, but really regardless of who's in power, that this is an issue that folks from all across the country of all different backgrounds can and do agree on. So focusing on soil health, I think, is a way to address a wide range of issues is a really important starting point. We also talked a lot about our approach to federal policy making, and whether it's an individual proposal that we're championing or whether we are making recommendations to other folks about where opportunities might exist to advance soil health. First and foremost try to think about proposals or initiatives that are voluntary so that farmers can adopt them, where and how it suits them. We're looking at no big sort of government expansions or even regulatory approaches, and instead sort of meeting producers where they are. So some of those, and just looking for sort of like no or low cost proposals as well. There tend to be sort of overarching caps, especially in the U.S. The Farm Bill, the sort of big omnibus food and agriculture piece of legislation. There are sort of larger strings and dynamics in terms of how much that bill overall can cost. So wherever we can identify work that can make the lives of producers easier and can advance soil health, but we can kind of find innovative, low cost ways to do that. That's always something that's going to go higher up the list for us. And those principles, I think, will continue to apply in this administration, and as we kind of regroup on trying to pass a farm bill as a collective this year.
I think it's also really important to understand that soil health is and has not been a politicized issue. I mean, whether it's Senator Thune, who's now the head of the Republican Party in the Senate, has been a soil health champion forever, at least as long as we've been engaging in this subject. And there are equally vociferous champions on the other side of the aisle. So I think that this is one of those rare places where, because American agriculture takes place a lot of the time in the center of the country, it really is a place where conservatives really do care and um, push a lot of the agricultural policy in this country. And if you're engaged in trying to help farmers and help the agricultural system function better, be more resilient, have the kind of success that we want it to have, you're going to find champions, all across the aisle in places that a lot of people often in sort of California or media centric places sort of don't necessarily identify those members in those places as being in support of things that they might find also really important. So it
Right.
is one of, as Arya said, common ground places. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it also touches on a lot of areas that are not common ground, right? It touches on human health, it touches on, use of chemical pesticides, it touches on even climate change. It also touches on a lot of cross-sector collaboration. You guys have worked with legislators, NGOs, farmers, businesses. You guys have a very producer-centric perspective. Can you share an example of collaboration that sort of exceeded your expectations and maybe the ingredients of what made it successful?
I mean, I can at least think about the bill that the first bill that we worked on that was really successful in Congress was a bill that had initially been proposed by Senator Thune, in fact, and so that was a bill that provided funding for soil health practices and support for farmers, which is something that we supported and advocated for increased dollars to be put into that program in federal legislation. So yeah, that's an area. When we first got to DC under the Trump administration, which a lot of people find surprising, but that is absolutely the way that Land Corps really started working in this space. So.
Yeah. That's a great example. Thank you for sharing. For a lot of people, including myself, that aren't that familiar with the political landscape, there's a lot of different agencies involved. And um, could you give the cliff notes on how the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Science Service, the FSA, the Farm Service Agency, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, how they all work together and how you work with each of them to influence soil policy?
Well, broadly speaking, we have the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they really do the lion's share of overseeing the work of soil health, of production agriculture, of farmers and ranchers, mostly on private working lands, but also some public lands as well. And then within that, the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, was originally the Soil Conservation Service. It was established by FDR during the Dust Bowl when they recognized the need to address the issues that they were having at the time with erosion. And so they really focused in on the importance of conserving soil. And now more broadly, the NRCS oversees a range of conservation programs that are voluntary and that allow stewards of land to implement different conservation practices, many of which help build soil, but that also have some other benefits, both economically and for natural resources. So those are wonderful, and those are a real sort of go-to, I think, very often when folks enter the public policy space and they express an interest in soil health or agriculture, you're sort of escorted towards the NRCS conservation programs like Environmental Quality Incentives Program or the Conservation Stewardship Program. But especially from Land Corps' perspective, that's kind of a starting point. It's a government program that requires farmers to kind of enroll, and they implement the practice, and then they receive sort of payment for half of those practices afterwards. So there's a little bit of a process that they have to go through. Other government agencies like FSA, like the Farm Service Agency, are where farmers go to receive support for loans and finance to finance their operations. Farmers are business owners, and very often small business owners, and need capital, to support whether it's payment for land or payment for equipment, for seed, for fencing, all of that. So the Farm Service Agency is a place where especially sort of new, young, beginning, and sometimes historically underserved producers can go to get support. And then one that you didn't mention under USDA that is, I think, will feed into some of our conversation later is RMA, is the Risk Management Agency, and they oversee federal crop insurance in this country, which is a major form of support and kind of a safety net for especially for big commodity producers, but really for producers of all kinds, to help them weather market uncertainties and then also risk. And then regarding the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that's actually an agency that we work with less directly. I think, as I mentioned before, a lot of our approach is focused on sort of voluntary programs and measures for producers, and those tend to be primarily housed at USDA, although we just issued a set of policy recommendations for the new Trump administration, and really we see opportunities to advance soil health in all sorts of places, whether it's the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management, looking at how we might build soil health on our public lands, our rangelands, or whether it's the idea of thinking about how soil health can be a risk-reducing tool at at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or Army Corps of Engineers. So we're looking for all sorts of creative outlets. Health and Human Services, of course, is another one for folks who are tracking the kind of topic of food as medicine, and looking for ways to improve human health through our soil health and our agriculture. So there's actually really, I think, a lot of opportunity, but it's just a question of bandwidth and people's focus and time and interest.
Yeah, it touches on so many different places. And one interesting note about sort of the history of prioritization of soil health in our country, I wasn't aware of that. That's a really interesting note. And you made a perfect segue around risk reduction, because that's where I'd like to go next. Is speaking to soil health and risk reduction. You guys are exploring the risk reducing benefits of healthy soils, including the potential of crop insurance applications. Could you break down for me the key findings of your research so far? And can you explain the sort of public private partnership designation of UX crop insurance and how those entities are designed, how your research has the ability to impact them, et cetera?
I think I'll take the first step and then I'll let Arya cover the second half. I think that from a big picture, the work that we're trying to do is to ensure that we can quantify the risk reduction that's associated to soil health. So right now, there's this sort of broad understanding that a lot of farmers and a lot of other folks have, that there is a correlation, but what it is exactly is a little bit ambiguous. And when we initially went to DC and started talking to members about soil health and the importance that it has, we talked about risk a lot, and there was a big question of how much. Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a 2% reduction or a 20% reduction? Or 100% reduction. Like, what are we talking about? And um, we realized pretty quickly that without having those details, that it was very, very hard to have policy conversations. What was somebody going to draft, and how were they going to do it? And so we began the conversation with an academic team who could really potentially look into this and quantify what the risk reduction was associated to which practices in which areas. And that those kind of three buckets, like what is it, where is it, and how much is it, are the kind of things that we've been focusing on primarily. And we've been very, very fortunate to have um, actually government funding to have government grants that have helped us do this research. And we've been working with a number of universities. We work with UC Berkeley, with Michigan State, with Rice University, and University of Arkansas are the sort of the main lead organizations, or professors at those institutions, and we've been pushing forward with that over the last couple of years, and it's been very exciting. So.
And just to follow on to that, how do you guys deal with the amount of diversity that can exist within regenerative agriculture? Like, I imagine within a monoculture, you're talking about these very specific, relatively, they're trying to take nature and sort of put it into these very specific conditions. But when you're talking about regenerative agriculture, first, there's the question of what is it? There's so many definitions. You're talking about diversity of plant life, diversity of, the soil microbiome. You're talking about different weather patterns, different crop types. How do you guys even begin to narrow down variables in research such that an agency, a government agency, could ensure something like this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're fortunate to have the policy work to also allow us to sort of have a broader set of areas where we can focus. But specifically for the risk model project, we decided to we are looking at the impact of more diverse crops. And we decided to focus on the impact of three specific and I think, accepted kind of main soil health practices. So we're looking at cover cropping, crop rotations, and then the impact of tillage and reduced tillage. So picking three practices was practices that we know that the USDA is already familiar with, practices that are fairly sort of common in agricultural communities, was a starting place. And then we've also partly due simply just to the availability of data. We're using remotely sensed geospatial data for this statistical model that we're building. And so due to the availability of data, we have started by primarily modeling the impact of those soil health practices on corn and soybean fields. And then we also, for the purposes again of the study, picked 9 Midwestern states. So it's a really big, ambitious scope, but also recognize, I think, of course, with more data and idea, we're always happy to talk with partners about sort of imagining how we might build out data sets so that we can look at the impact of these practices across more crop types and in more regions. But for now, that's where we've started. And we think that those practices also allow for the institutions that we're really trying to work with and move the needle on. Banks and insurers, I think, can kind of speak in the language of practices. And this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but compared to, say, like a carbon market or an ecosystem services market that is maybe looking at more specific outcomes, like taking a measurement in the soil and saying, well, what is the soil organic matter or the soil carbon? This approach of looking at risk and measuring the impact of practices allows us to not only recognize and potentially reward producers who have done that work historically, which some of these carbon markets and other schemes will leave out because they're only looking to reward folks who are like, well, what new gains can you get? So risk assessment allows us to acknowledge farmers and their historical work, but it also allows us to be predictive and to say, okay, well, a bank is interesting when working with a group of producers in Champaign County in Illinois, and what would happen if they started to add even just like 1 or 2 additional crops into their rotation and diversify their operations just a little bit. Is that a change that would pay off? And so we're really excited about that work because as I kind of indicated just in the breakdown of the agencies, crop insurance and finance are tools that farmers are already using. So we really like the idea of kind of meeting producers where they are and offering them ways to make their operations more resilient, working with partners that they're already working with.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. I mean, meeting them where they're at and working with, some of the largest crops in the country that, make up the majority of our agricultural production. It seems like a natural starting point for the work. And what is the timeline for the work? And, what does the vision look like if a farmer's saying, wow, I'm wanting to integrate some of these practices, how can I reduce my risk and coverage? What do you anticipate the future of this work looks like?
So, I mean, we have a very early beta of the tool that's being developed now. I think it's probably on a 2-year ish schedule in terms of our ability to work that out so that it's a more fully uh, you know accessible tool that really a lot of people can use. But I think that our goal is to be able to work with the finance side of things, with the lenders and the insurers and those folks, so that they can pass on the savings and incentivize these practices because there's a risk reduction. And we know that. So it's just quantifying what that risk reduction is, how much of a risk reduction, and um, is it just a cover crop, or is it exponentially better when you have a cover crop and you add a rotation or reduced tillage, or is how do those things work collectively, um, and so that there's a lot of understanding that we still have to sort of sort out in order for that pricing to be specific. But as we start to show that there's risk reduction there, what we want this to be is a way that it makes um, farming less expensive and more accurately priced for those who are lower risk. And so our whole goal is to identify the practices that are really, helping certain producers be ahead of the curve and allow for others to really join. Because obviously there are a lot of challenges that farmers have, and the more that we can do to take some of that risk off the table, the better off we're going to
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the vision of success for this project is an industry in agriculture where a good soil discount is kind of as commonplace as a good driver discount in auto insurance, or as a non-smoker discount in health insurance. We want it to be, this is not because the insurance companies like you and are their friends. It's because they're recognizing that there are sort of, commonplace or common sense risk reduction steps that producers can take. And so that both that kind of incentive and I think also just that kind of understanding is a really achievable place that I think that we can get to, both at USDA, but also with sort of cross-sector partners in the industry. And we're excited to see more and more folks kind of coming to that conversation.
It makes so much sense. I was even thinking about when you purchase a vehicle, the incentives you get for purchasing an electric vehicle, because that's quantifiable and it becomes common sense and helping people make the link, even just from a public discourse standpoint of that, soil health practices reduce your risk. I mean, that's a huge leap forward, both, financially for producers, but also just for the public to really understand that piece. Speaking of public understanding, I want to pivot to natural disasters and soil health. So there've been a number of natural disasters in the last few months, from Hurricane Helene to the recent fires in Los Angeles. How do these natural disasters, how do you think they influence public perception and policy priorities around soil health? And can this play a role in natural disaster mitigation?
Yeah, I think, I mean, our hearts are heavy for sure with the LA fires. And, uh, I think this is a funny moment where lots of different folks will try to make their issue um, kind of try and make the connection between disasters and their particular issue. I don't think that this will be sort of an immediate next step from the fires, but absolutely sort of taking a step back. I think we know for sure that healthier soils hold on to more water and are able to make both producers on their farms as well as the surrounding areas more resilient in terms of um, holding on to capturing more water when it rains and not immediately sort of flooding, or being able to go further into drought conditions, because they've built up the soil organic matter and the water content in their soils. And similarly, I think especially when you start to look at the role of animal integration, and livestock, of fuel reduction, and of building up soils through managed grazing, there's really tremendous opportunities to reduce wildfire risk, and I think sort of risk in general, both again on public lands as well as farmers' lands. Harley, do you want to build on that at all?
Well, I mean, the only thing I was just the flood and drought side of it is we have these increasing, you know, patterns of flood and drought, and soil is really the um, most obvious tool that we can start to implement at scale, so that we can build resilience. And ultimately, Landcorp's mission is to ensure that our agricultural system is safe and secure. And this is really something that we don't need to wait necessarily for government, and you don't necessarily need to wait for some external partner. These are things that can be done um, on farms all over the place. What we do want is for barriers that are in place to be removed. We want to make sure that the systems that are in place acknowledge that those benefits are there, and if those systems are like insurance and other things that are systems that farmers engage with, that those recognize that risk reduction, and just price things appropriately. And if you are lower risk, that you pay less. That's something that is pretty straightforward. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to just do very common sense things. And I think that that's why Landcorp as an organization spends a lot of time in DC, because there is a lot of opportunity to um, explain these systems that people didn't necessarily pay that much attention to uh, when things were the way they were a decade or two ago. And when we're looking at the volatility that we have now and the risk that farmers have now, it's just different than it used to be. And so, therefore, the urgency of doing these things now has shifted pretty dramatically, and this is a time where there's a solution that people can really take, and it doesn't engage large government spending or some new, uh, you know, it doesn't require a massive uh, investment on a certain sense economically. What it requires is a shift in thinking, so that we can understand and appropriately identify what needs to be done and then provide just the support that exists and shift it in that direction just a little bit.
That makes a ton of sense. And one of my follow-up questions is when public perception, when there's a debate about what actually improves soil health. So for example, I was reading an article recently about a lot of the ranch lands, a lot of the grazing lands in Point Reyes in Northern California. I think they've just been taken away from ranchers and made into conservation lands. And that was an article that sparked something interesting for me around the public perception of cattle ranching, public perception of conservation, of what actually does build soil health. And there's a large debate around that. And how do you all handle that? And what do you think your role is in that public discourse?
Yeah, I understand I think both sides of the debate, and that it's a really nuanced conversation. And I think it's very easy to take either just sort of a sort of traditional Western environmental lens and say like cows and grazing are bad, or to say, to go on the other side and say that, ranching is a fundamentally like American way of life and we need to protect that. There's livelihoods and sort of everything in between. Um, we had the opportunity actually to submit some public comments to the Bureau of Land Management. They had I think it was last year, 2023, they had a proposed rule on a new sort of conservation rule for the agency. And Land Court took the approach of saying that fundamentally this is an opportunity for regenerative or holistically managed grazing to provide an opportunity where we can be meeting conservation goals, maybe even more effectively than if animals weren't present on those landscapes. And the emphasis is on like well managed, so that it's not just letting livestock sort of run amok, or to overgraze or to trample sensitive areas, but to be moved from place to place appropriately, and that they can be providing incredible kind of economic opportunities for producers as well. So even though I think the temptation is there to view those uses as opposed, that actually sort of human management and sort of careful use of animals on the landscape, but as um, animals have been on the landscape, in this country for millennia, and that those needs and goals can be copacetic rather than viewed in opposition. So it's a nuanced take, but I think it's possible.
It's the how, not the what, right? It's like, how do you do it? And as Arya said, I think that our goal is to uh, really help people understand how we can engage with our producers in ways that are not in any way looking at them as you know um, as being on the wrong side of the fence, but in fact being the people who can really provide the thing that we need the most. Having well managed grazing on public lands is, as Arya said, the way that we can really most actively not just maintain, but like regenerate and reinvigorate a lot of those lands in really substantive ways that can't be done by just leaving them alone. It's going to take millennia if you just put a fence around it, and let it revive at its own pace. But if you bring in actively well managed grazing, we can restore things at a much faster pace. And it's just a question of whether or not those ranchers have the resources that they need, understand the training that they need, understand the things that they've been doing forever that work really well, and the things that are potentially damaging and can't be or at least should be they should be made aware of, in some way. So
Yeah.
it's a conversation that needs to be had, and not just think of it as a yes or no option.
Yeah, it's such an important perception shift, from, from the conservation lens that human intervention is bad, and actually recognizing that the way that humans have engaged with landscapes over millennia has, created some of the most beautiful biodiverse ecologies in our world. And so I think there's an important merging there in between ranching and conservation that it's great to see you guys engaging with at a policy level. I want to shift our conversation as we near the end here to talk a little bit about market-based solutions and incentives. And so you guys are doing the work of monetizing soil health. You're developing market-based strategies that reward farmers for investing in soil health. What are some innovative examples you've seen, and what are some of the challenges with scaling these solutions?
Um, I mean, I can take a first pass at this. I'm sure Ari will have her own things to add, but I think that really the simple things first. I think that when we're talking about risk in the way that we have insurance, banking, those kinds of things come up right at the top of the list. If you have, uh, Arya talked about the good driver discount, like that is the same kind of understanding that we have of health. If we have that in agriculture, and we can start to extend those discounts to farmers who are reducing risk, and they're not just reducing their own risk, they're reducing the larger risk. So there are potentially resources that can be put into that, education that can be put into that, and a lot of funding that can go towards that, that doesn't necessarily come from the government, but that comes from industry and like insurance, that has this direct beneficial impact if people lower risk, or banks have a direct impact because they can give more loans to more people who are going to be more successful and make more money if they can quantify that appropriately. And so those are the starting places that we've been looking at. And then there's obviously the way in which government supports those, and then government does its own lending, government does its own insuring. And so those are ways in which the government can directly engage in that, to support the farmers, and to make them both more resilient and more profitable.
I'll also quickly mention that in food and agriculture, whether it's philanthropy or lending from traditional or innovative banks or investment, the recognition of food and ag, and the landscape as being nuanced, as taking time. I think we hear over and over again the call for more patient, flexible capital, but not every farm business is going to look the same. That as you diversify what you grow on the farm, you're also diversifying and adding some complexity to your business model, and having more recognition of that from lenders and investors is an ongoing and important kind of need that we hear from producers all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Regenerative finance is definitely a growing industry, and something that is gaining attention. I think it's important to recognize that, the government itself plays a huge role in that when it becomes to their relationship with producers. So the last thing I want to talk about here is, empowering people to engage. How do people that are not involved in policy and politics, that might be intimidated by it, that feel daunted by it, what's your message to someone that wants to get involved either at a state or a federal level, and doesn't know where to start?
I would say, come on in. The water is nice. It's not so bad. I have been really proud and grateful to see colleagues who maybe when Landcorp first started, their reaction was like, "Oh, federal policy, huh? Good for you." And now we have started to see more folks saying, "Actually, this is an area that I want to get involved in." And so I have seen the ways that individuals and organizations have started to build capacity for policy in their organizations or in working groups. I mean, one way that folks can get involved is to join a coalition, so that perhaps you're not sort of convening or coming up with a policy strategy for your individual organization from scratch, but you can keep tabs on the work from other relevant groups, or it might be very aligned groups, or it might be a sort of a group of quote unquote strange barn fellows. I think unlikely alliances are just as valuable as teaming up with folks who who you could already finish their sentences. Land Corps has a bunch of resources. We have our monthly newsletter, and we try to keep it can be a little text heavy, but we try to keep it approachable and break it down for folks. If anyone's interested in legislation or tracking a particular bill, we also have a Land Corps Federal Soil Health Bill Tracker, and that is pretty much every bill that has been introduced in Congress that would have some impact on soil health or resilience if passed. So that we try to keep that as an educational and nonpartisan resource for folks. So lots of ways to get involved, and we're also happy to have conversations with people too who want to take it a little further.
Yeah, one thing I would just say is focus. I think that Land Corps has been very, very focused on soil health, and that kind of prevents whatever political ambiguity that might otherwise be muddling. Like, this is just a way that if soil health is your focus, the people who support soil health are are on your team. You know, they may or may not be people that you agree with on a whole host of other issues, but if they're soil health champions, they are your champions. And this is an area where we have been very we've had a lot of success, and then I think that there's a lot of opportunity for people to think of things in that context. Um, you know, find the one thing that you want. Don't look at this big picture. Just be very focused, and you'd be surprised how people are willing to openly talk to you and advance that one thing. As long as you stay on that, you'll realize that you actually have a lot of connections on that issue.
That's great advice. And those are some great resources that I'll be sure to link for people. And my last question for you all is about bridging the gap. Soil health can feel like a niche topic. I've often felt like human health is a way to get people engaged in the regenerative agriculture movement holistically and make it personal to them. How do we expand the conversation and bring in more diverse voices to amplify the movement? What does that look like for you all?
And I think that right now that's an interesting moment because HHS very well may be run by RFK, who has had an interest in regenerative agriculture for some time. So there is a lot of interest in that overlap, and I think that that's a place that a lot of people who may have less intrinsic interest in soil health and see the immediacy of their own personal health might be able to engage and kind of push HHS to work more on the things that are going to ultimately build a healthy food system. And so understanding that these two things overlap very heavily is a way that I think a broader range of people can engage, because I think personal health is a thing that a lot of people care about personally. And so that's a new area. I don't know, Arya, what do you think?
I think you're right, Paige, that human health is an expanded area, and that also consumers, I think, are more able to participate than they were even sort of 5-10 years ago in terms of the number of brands that are sharing those stories. And I think more sort of public education and storytelling will always go a long way. It's an interesting time. I also think that American consumer, it can sound kind of niche, but we all lived through the pandemic, and even now we're aware of egg shortages. I think that folks actually do kind of deep down understand these issues related to the kitchen table and grocery stores, and are sympathetic if we just bring folks along and reach out.
Huge thank you to Arya and Harley for investing their life's work into the organization Land Corps. In divisive political climates, it becomes increasingly important to stay informed and support organizations doing the great work of moving the policy needle forward. Thank you for joining us for another episode. Wherever you listen to your podcasts, please take the time to subscribe, rate, and review the show. It makes all the difference in the world. Till next time, I'm your host, Paige Fay.